had been sent to dismantle her life. Loving her was not part of anyone's plan. The message that dropped into my lap was clinical and small, an assignment wrapped in a single line. Get close, gather proof, bring down Alicia Moretti. No name for the sender beyond an initial, no badge, no Academy of Justice. Just a whisper of money, and a dossier with crisp photographs and a few lines scribbled in a shorthand I learned to read over the years. Proximity, plausibility, plausible deniability. It suited me. Quiet, invisible, useful. Her office was at the top of a tower that looked like a blade. I remember stepping out of the elevator and feeling the air thin. The city spread below like a map you could fold and tuck away. The door opened to a room so exact it cut. White marble, glass-like water held in place by steel. A single orchid that seemed to consider me with a patient, almost disdainful bloom. Above it, Alicia sat like a small god at a desk of light, her profile turned toward the window. The sunset flattened around her, and she held the light the way jewelry does. It made her sharper. She smelled like jasmine, and something colder beneath it. Winter breath held in a cup. Her voice was measured. It could have been designed to calm armies. It was also designed to allow no interference. "You were recommended," she said. The words were neither warm nor hostile. They were precise. "You have experience in organization, attention to detail." I had rehearsed an answer that sounded accidental. "I'm thorough." It would have been a lie. I was thorough because I needed to be. Because thoroughness kept my hands from shaking when the risk pressed close. I did not say that. She watched me until I finished the lie. She asked what I wanted. She asked what I feared. She asked little things, about family, about why I liked dead plants. And because the questions were small, I answered with the exact smallness expected of someone applying for an assistant role. She made me small without trying. I liked that about her. I was supposed to dislike it. When she offered me the job, she did it like a verdict, final and unappealable. "Move in," she said. "You'll be on probation for 3 months. You'll sleep in the guest wing. You follow the rules. You don't access the east wing without permission. You wear what's provided. You answer when I call." There was something willfully theatrical about the way she spoke the rules, as if she were rehearsing lines for a play where everyone already knew their parts. I said yes, out of habit more than conviction. I sent a single word back to the sender that night. Confirmed. It felt obscene and necessary, like shaking a hand with a stranger while my other hand hid a knife. This was the beginning. It also felt like being lowered into a well of diamonds with a rope that might fray. I told myself that once I had what they wanted, the ledger's shadow, whatever unsigned proof they thought could unmake a woman like Alicia, I would leave. I would fold my life back into its old shape. I had orders. Orders are surprisingly heavy things. If you like dangerous romances and slow-burn reunions, stay with me. The house on the edge of the city was not a house. It was a statement. It sat on a rise like a fortress that had read too many romantic novels and decided to live inside one. High walls, gates the color of old iron, a long driveway that had been flattened by generations of tires and expensive shoes. Guards lingered at the periphery, well-cut men whose eyes never smiled. Luca, head of security, had a face that managed to be friendly and threatening at once. He watched me the way a man watches a chessboard, interested, calculating, ready. There was loyalty written in the way he moved when Alicia was near. Loyalty that might be paid or part of a debt. I filed it away. Inside, the house obeyed a different law. It was all pale stone and long shadows. Cameras watched hallways the way saints once watched altars. There were rules plastered in the air the moment you stepped inside. Shoes removed at the door, no phones left idly around, arguments discouraged as though brightness could disinfect them. Her staff moved like trained instruments, quiet, clean, efficient. Even the air felt monitored, as if each breath answered to a registry. My bedroom overlooked a courtyard, where bitter orange trees leaned and watched, as if they too knew what happened here. The first night, I lay awake and listened. The house hummed. Pipes, the crosstalk of distant televisions, the soft slap of someone else's footsteps. In the room next to mine, there was the sound of Alicia's heels on marble, a firm, decisive rhythm. I tried to count the beats, to map her presence as if geometry could protect me. I did not sleep much. Days passed with a strange, disciplined routine. I became a ghost of domestic competence. I was careful with the wine list, precise with calendars, accurate with phone messages. I learned that her world could be reduced to lists and spreadsheets, and the soft, inevitable violence of decision. That was the public side of the empire. The private side arrived later, in small doses that tasted like confession. Little things began to accumulate. A photograph of a dock at night tucked between magazines in the library. A ledger entry in an account I wasn't authorized to see that hinted at movement too large for a single company. The watchful silence of men who carried themselves like secrets. None of these things nailed her down. You could not pin a woman like Alicia to a single truth. She was too adept at being several things at once. I started keeping a journal. I told myself it was for the senders, for the organization that had put me there. I cataloged the shifts in mood, the nights when gunmetal thunder rolled in and we all pretended not to hear it. I took photographs with a camera that had been given to me under the pretense of inventory. I watched her the way you watch the sky before a storm. Then I found the door. It was not a door in the obvious sense. It was a seam in a wall of books, an ordinary pull hidden among spines that spoke of law and architecture and things that did not interest me. I should have walked away. I did not. Curiosity is practical if you are paid to be curious. The room beyond smelled like old paper and dust, and the metallic tang of someone who handled secrets for a living. It was small, lit by a single, harsh bulb that made everything look like an exhibit. Against the far wall, a bank of monitors glowed with grainy black and white images. Gates, a dock, a waterline I recognized from that magazine photograph I'd found earlier. I stepped closer, and the room seemed to inhale. There were photographs pinned to the cork beside the monitors, careful rows of faces captured in unguarded moments. Arrivals, departures, hands gripping railings. There was a photograph of me. I looked at myself as if through someone else's eyes. A face in a doorway, hair tucked behind one ear. The expression I'd practiced to make myself unremarkable. Under my photograph was a small file, its cover labeled with a name that had once felt like a blank space. My name, printed in crisp, dark letters. On top of my file lay a scrap of paper with a sentence written in a hand that had a calm cruelty to it. Do not touch her. The handwriting could have been a decree. It could have been a threat. It could have been a command to those who served Alicia to keep some person, me, untouched, unmolested, like a sanctified animal in a menagerie. The message was simple, and it rewired something in my chest. I understood in that room of monitors and angles that I was not the only hunter here, that someone had been mapping me while I mapped Alicia. The files did not explain motive. They did not give instruction. They were evidence that I was entangled in a net that had been woven long before I walked into the tower. When I left the room, the air felt altered. There is a kind of gravity to knowledge. I had been pried loose from ignorance, and with that came weight. The mission I'd accepted, my neat, tidy role as agent of ruin, suddenly seemed flimsy next to everything I was learning. And yet, it also felt deeper. If someone wanted me untouched, perhaps what they sought was precisely the thing I'd been sent to take away. Confronting this was supposed to be rational. Gather more. Report. Withdraw. Instead, the discovery made me reckless in the small ways. I found excuses to be near her. Once, under the pretense of organizing files, I entered her private study and listened to the way she talked on the phone when she thought no one was listening. She spoke as if she weighed every person like a coin. She did not waste words. She did not apologize for the shape her life had to take to survive. When she laughed, it was short and rare. A small, bright sound that looked like a break in ice. There were warnings, too. Old scars in her hands, a small twitch when certain names came up. A bruise that lived in the corner of her mouth for a week. Secrets have fingerprints. They leave traces. They also demand protection. Protectors moved around her like a flock. They cut off access, rerouted schedules, invented reasons why someone could not meet. Luca's presence always seemed to increase around me when she was unhappy. I felt the pressure of eyes like a hand closing. And then came the moment that would begin to loosen my resolve. We were alone in a way that the house seldom allowed. The staff had been sent on errands. The world outside had softened into a rain that made the marble reflect like a blackened sea. She had called me to her dining room, a narrow, ceremonial space with low light, the scent of slow-cooked food that had the patience of a threat. The candles were unscented, the table set for two as if we were the only people left in the world. We ate with the ridiculous civility of people who keep their mouths busy to avoid saying something that could burn. Conversation was a quiet duel. She asked about my family. She asked about my tastes. She asked where I had learned to keep my hands steady. I answered with the same slivers of truth I'd offered at the tower. It was enough. Halfway through the meal, without fanfare, she said, "No one is allowed to touch you." I felt my throat tighten. The words landed like a stone. "I'm not," I began, because ignorantly, I had always believed the one who cared least had more freedom to leave. She cut me off with a look that had once commanded boardrooms and markets. "It's a rule," she said. "For you. For that file." She reached forward and touched the back of my hand once. Light, an inspection more than affection. And the contact sent a small electric current through me that had nothing to do with intention and everything to do with recognition. "We protect the things we cannot replace," she said, "even if they're problems." Her hand was warm and human. In that hum of warmth, a dozen alarms went off in me. Not because I was afraid for myself, though I was, but because the hand that had been a stranger carried with it an admission. Whatever the Empire did, whatever her choices had been or would be, she did not want me to be harmed. That notion was at once arrogant and touching. A billionaire's possessiveness disguised as care. We left the table in a silence that tasted like an unsaid agreement. Later, in the shadowed corridor on my way to my room, I thought with a clarity that frightened me. My mission had always required a kind of detachment, a willingness to be uncompromising in service to a cause I'd never been asked to believe in. Now I was compromised in the most stupid, human way possible. I had begun to care whether she survived. That was the first dangerous tilt. There were other moments, small, dangerous moments that had nothing to do with missions and everything to do with the slow chemistry between two people who have been trained to hide everything but are suddenly tired of doing so. She once held my chin between two fingers and asked me what I wanted, if not power. I told her truthfully, I wanted a place that was mine where I could go to sleep without counting exits. She smiled in a way that suggested she had considered buying such a thing once, and then decided any place worth having required maintenance she was not willing to provide. I was not immune to the ways she softened when we were alone. She was brittle with the world, but when she let her guard drop, unexpectedly, briefly, she looked younger. She laughed more, her hands unknotted. I began to count, secretly, the number of times I saw that softness. It made each sighting feel like an embarrassment and a salvation both. The file with my name hummed at the edge of every interaction. I had seen my face in the surveillance room long enough that it felt like a stitched part of the house. I kept telling myself it was still an assignment. I kept sending the tiny coded messages back to the sender. Confirmations, requests for contact, silent little telegrams into a place I could not see. The senders remained a shadow. They were not interested in warmth. They demanded results. They saw the world as numbers and vulnerabilities. The line between professional distance and curiosity blurred when she asked me one night to stay up with her. It had been raining for hours, and the house smelled like wet stone. She sat in a low chair by the window and watched the city breathe faintly in its lights. She did not light a cigarette, though I had seen her do it once before with the ceremonial care of someone conducting delicate work. Instead, she poured 2 glasses of whiskey and offered me one without asking if I wanted it. "Do you ever think about who we were before we became who we are?" she asked after a long sip. Her voice was softer, closer to the room than to the world. I told her the truth. Sometimes I thought about a kitchen table I had once sat at, the quiet presence of a mother who had taught me to fix broken things with too much glue and not enough patience. I talked about small, safe histories because bigger confessions were liabilities. She nodded as if filing away the answer. "I learned to survive by learning how to make fear bail out of a room," she said. There was no self-pity in her voice, just a flat, almost clinical observation. "Only survival has a price. It's addictive. It becomes the only way to feel steady." Her admission was not confession. It was a ledger entry with a heart. She seemed to be weighing me, seeing whether I would take the confession as a stepping stone or a warning. I was supposed to take it as ammunition to bring to the sender. Instead, when she placed her hand on mine, no dramatic gesture, just the smallest assurance, I felt the assignment disintegrate like paper in rain. The first kiss happened in a way that was terrible and inevitable. It was not cinematic. There was no perfect moonlight or music that insisted we obey it. It happened when she leaned forward to read a small note I had left on her desk about a schedule change. The paper slipped between her fingers, and she looked up at me as if surprised by how close I was. For a second, the entire house held its breath. Then she reached and everything contracted. Her mouth was not soft at first. It was decisive. It tasted faintly of whiskey and of jasmine, of late nights and decisions that had been made to protect something fragile. I kissed back because it was the only answer I knew. When our lips met, it was less like collision than like folding. 2 things that had been under pressure for so long finding the integrity of being held. It was immediate and terrifying, and for a moment, true in a way my orders had never been. We separated because sense returned like gravity. There was consent, of course. We both pulled back. She looked at me with that same precise assessment she used in business. "This changes things," she said. "Do we stop it?" I asked. And even as I asked, I knew I did not mean stop it. I had never expected to be permitted to mean anything to her. I had expected to be a tool. She considered me, her hand still on the paper, then turned the page. "We decide what it is," she said. "We decide what rules apply." When she said those words, I felt the full contradiction of my life. I was a woman with a mission that asked for detachment, placed inside the orbit of someone who wanted me kept like a rare object. I had been sent to destroy her, to find what would break the empire she wore like armor. Now I sat across a table from the woman whose power had made entire industries tremble, and wondered what it meant to become the object kept safe. There were practical reminders of the impossible reality we were in. Luca's presence was a thrumming undercurrent. The staff was a watchful chorus. The house itself had eyes, and I had seen the photograph of myself pinned to a corkboard in a room full of monitors. I knew I was being watched. I knew, too, that someone with both reach and restraint, had written in my file the words, "Do not touch her." The message had a coldness to it that suggested a limit placed by someone who feared what attachment could do to their operation. That fear was mine now, too. In those first days after the kiss, the world split into 2 kinds of time. Before and after. Before. Time when I could move with a single-minded purpose. My every rational act focused on gathering what would bring her down. After. Time when my hands lingered over a teacup, when her name trailed into my dreams. I began to record less for the senders and more for myself. My handwriting changed. My notes turned from lists into fragments. Jasmine in November. The way she tucks her hair back when she concentrates. the bruise that faded over a week on her wrist. Little witness marks that had nothing to do with legal proof and everything to do with memory. I tried to keep faith with the mission. I tried to imagine the moment I would hand those files over to the shadow who had hired me and watch as their satisfaction neutralized what I had felt. I pictured the paper in a neat pile and my relief at being free. It was a fantasy that made the house feel smaller and my lungs lighter. Real life was more complicated. One evening, after a day of meetings that had required me to be both invisible and efficient, Alicia asked me to walk the gardens with her. We pulled heavy coats around us against a rain that had started fine and relentless. The garden paths ran like lit veins through clipped hedges. In the hush, away from the cameras that had not been obvious but were never far, she asked me why I had taken the job. "You said application," she murmured. "Why did you answer?" I thought of the senders, of the files, of the cold calculation that had sent me across a city to be someone else. I did not tell her. Instead, I said, "I wanted to see how the other half lived." She laughed, a small thing that warmed the air like a candle. "It's less than it looks," she said. "More precise, less lovely. But sometimes you can buy peace." "Can you buy safety?" I asked. It was a stupid question because she had whole departments devoted to making sure doors stayed locked and enemies stayed at a distance. She stopped and looked at me then, something like pity and pride and loneliness in her eyes at once. "You cannot buy what you are willing to live with," she said. "You can only trade one kind of fear for another." The trade between us was unspoken. We had been bartered against each other in ways that left me impulsive and tired. I wanted to be the woman who could take what she had been sent to take and leave. I also wanted not to destroy what was becoming like a shelter, like a home I had not intended to have. The conflict was not theatrical. It was a constant small pain that lived between two beats of breath. And then came a moment that widened the rip. I found, tucked into the bottom drawer of my dresser, a small token that was not mine. A necklace with a charm in the shape of a tiny key. It had been placed there with minute deliberation. There was no note, just the cool metal, an object whose presence felt like a question. I wore it the next day. It sat against my skin like a promise I had not authorized. Alicia glanced at it once and did not comment. The house seemed to relax around me as if some loose wire had been reattached. I tried to believe that small things did not reorient the entire world, but they did. To be given a token by a woman like her was to be acknowledged in a way that would be impossible to unacknowledge. The first part of my mission had been straightforward in my head. Move in, get access, gather. But nothing in a life with Alicia ever obeyed simplicity. Every step drew me further into her orbit, and further from the senders who had given me the assignment. Each secret room I found, every ledger I skimmed, the way her voice softened when she thought no one was around. All of it conspired to make the task a betrayal that would cost me something I could not predict. On the day I discovered the surveillance room, I sent a message back to the sender. Report. Multiple files. Found surveillance. My hands trembled. I did not say that my hands trembled because the tremble had nothing to do with fear of my handlers and everything to do with the giddy, precarious sensation of being seen by the woman whose photo had been on that wall. That night, after the kiss, and after the secret room, and after the token in my drawer, I lay awake and listened to the house breathe. I thought about the meaning of the words, "Do not touch her," and whether they had been written by someone who wanted to preserve me for a reason that would ruin everything I had been trained to do. I thought dangerously about choosing differently. In the dark, I pressed my fingers to the small key at my throat and tried to imagine the shape of the choice ahead. Continue to be an instrument of my senders. Hand over what I found and watch her fall. Or betray them, and betray myself. To protect the fragile, dangerous intimacy that had crept like a vine into my life. I had been sent to destroy her. I had learned, in the first few weeks of living inside her house, that the people who send you into rooms rarely understand the things that happen in those rooms. The way hands brush, how laughter can change strategy, how a kiss can render a file meaningless. I did not yet know what decision I would make. I only knew that the decision would not be clean. A week later, Alicia invited me into her study and closed the door behind us. The air felt thicker than usual, as if electricity hung like heavy fruit. She did not sit at her desk. She sat on the edge of an armchair and looked directly at me. "You know I keep a ledger," she said plainly. "Not just of money, of people, of favors." "Yes," I said. My voice felt thin. She rested her hands in her lap like someone folding a map. "I saw you in the surveillance room," she said. "I saw your face on the corkboard. I wanted to deny it, and I did not. Truth is sometimes the only currency that buys a little time." She smiled then, without malice, but without the softness I had begun to hope for. "Do not let anyone tell you what you are worth," she said. "Even the people who buy and sell you. Even the people who paid for you to be placed here." The sentence was oddly tender. It was also a warning. It exposed a truth I had been refusing. That in some corners of her life she was more compassionate than I had been willing to admit. It unsettled me because compassion is the enemy of a mission based on removal. She leaned forward, and in that motion, the house seemed to quiet again. "We make choices in the dark," she said, "and we live with their shape. Some are unbearable, some are necessary." "What do you want me to do?" I asked, though I knew she already had offered me the answer the night she touched my hand, in a way that more closely resembled custody than command. I wanted to believe there would be a simple path forward, some moral clarity that could cut the knot. She ran a finger along the arm of the chair. "If someone has sent you to destroy me," she said slowly, "that says as much about them as it does about me." For a long time I said nothing, because anything I could offer might have been ammunition. Things shifted in me like tectonic plates. I had been trained to strike. Now someone I had been sent to strike looked at me and suggested that perhaps the world's divisions were not as black and white as my handlers had insisted. We were both actors, and the script had been altered. That night, when I left her study, the house felt less like a fortress, and more like a stage set where the scene had been rewritten and the new lines had not been distributed. I had been sent with a clear objective. I had been given files and a purpose. But when you live long enough with a woman who builds empires the way other people build gardens, you learn the painful truth of what empire costs. It is not only in bodies or in money. It is in the way a person's hours are counted, how their decisions are catalogued by others. It is in the quiet of nights when someone else chooses who may live and who may be spared. The closer I got, the more I saw that her power had an architecture of survival, rather than cruelty alone. She had learned to be harsh because the world demanded it. She had learned to move like winter because spring had failed her before. I had been sent to remove a threat, and instead I found myself standing on a precipice, deciding what kind of life I wanted to lead if the world would let me choose. When she kissed me again, it was softer. It carried the weight of an apology and a promise, and I wanted to believe both. I also knew, with a clarity that felt like a knife at the back of my neck, that the senders would not be indifferent to my tenderness. There would be consequences for every step away from the mission. The house continued to watch. The photograph of me remained on the corkboard. The words "do not touch her" still haunted my file. And somewhere, in the place that had sent me, they were waiting for the deliverable I had promised. I had been sent to destroy her. Now I was being given a choice I had not been trained for: to complete my assignment and erase what had come between us, or to protect the fragile thing that had grown inside the walls of that house, a thing as dangerous and beautiful as an ember left too close to dry wood. I turned the small key at my throat and listened to the rain. The night was full of possibility and threat. I could feel, with a physical nausea, that the next decision would not simply be an answer to my handlers. It would be the first honest thing I did for myself. The night the house tried to kill us, everything that had been small and negotiable slammed into a single, unavoidable truth. Some choices end you. We had planned to leave the next morning. Everything had been arranged in a brittle way that made me think of origami, folds designed to hide a shape until the last crease. Alicia had spent the afternoon methodically burning paper records she said would make escape cleaner. Ledger copies, 2 staff lists, a handful of name invoices that read like anchors. She moved with a kind of ritual focus I had seen when she chose to cut someone out of her life. Precise, cold, efficient. When she wasn't working, she sat by the window and watched the rain the way a person watches a confession and decides whether to accept it. We argued over trivialities, the coat she insisted on taking, the route I wanted to use, which of us would take the keys. Each argument felt like a rehearsal for survival. I had rehearsed how to leave a place with less weight. Nothing prepares you for the way indecision smells like fear. I remember the sound before anything else. A low, percussion rumble that started in the bones and moved outward. We were halfway down the service stairs, coats in hand, when the house answered with a noise less obedient than thunder. A light in the corridor burst into a rain of glass. For a beat there was no sense, only a space where reason had been uprooted. The world narrowed into a sound and a smell, a metallic, hot scent like a closed oven. We ran because running is the nearest thing to thinking in a crisis. People shout in movies. In real life, the noise was a raw animal noise. The house's alarms and something deeper, a human panic. I remember turning toward Alicia and seeing her outline against the falling dust. She was a statue in motion, hair plastered against her face with rain or smoke, jaw set with a focus that had nothing to do with her usual economy of movement. Her hand found mine the way a map finds a marked place, and it was the first honest thing I'd felt that day. She wanted me safe. By the time the first responders, a swarm of people with uniforms too loud for what they did, arrived, the front drive had been a garden of glass and flame. I thought of the photograph of me in the surveillance room, the small file in which I had been catalogued. I thought of the words, "Do not touch her," and how they had been written in a hand that saw me as an object to be preserved. Now we were less objects than fugitives. There was chaos, scrambling, men barking orders, a man I knew as Luca pressing themselves forward. I remember meeting his face, composed, too familiar, and in that instant I saw the calculus of loyalty rearrange itself. If loyalty is a service, betrayal is its most efficient currency. He stepped between us and the men who were trying to push us toward the driveway, and I felt a coldness run through me I recognized from the way Alicia had once told me she kept the books. Tidy, inevitable. "You need to leave," he said to Alicia, voice flat. "Now." She looked at him like someone measuring a tool's usefulness. "We leave together," she said. He tightened his jaw. "You go separate and meet at the safe house. That's the plan." There was a firmness in him as if he were reciting orders he'd been given elsewhere. Something in me bristled so fast it felt like an animal's flinch. "We leave together," I repeated, more sharply than the situation called for. The house was on the edge of a precipice. Our next breath was uncertain. Luca's eyes flicked to me, and for the first time I saw the ledger of his loyalties. A ledger that did not balance in the way of old allegiances. His hand, the hand that had once rested on the back of Alicia's, protective, possessive, intimate, trembled the smallest amount. He reached, not for protection, but for a small device clipped to his belt. In the metallic glint of it, the world rearranged itself into betrayal. A smart object, a choice to answer to someone else. I had been betrayed before. It is a distinct ache to be betrayed in the exact place you thought you were safe. I seized for the thing in his hand, but there is an ugly truth about these moments. Muscles do not always obey moral imperative. Luca's face did not show cruelty. Instead, it showed a kind of terrible relief, as if relieving a weight he had been carrying too long. His loyalty had a price, and the price had been paid. Something hard and sudden happened after that. I did not watch in the way you watch movies. I was in it, my skin tasting coppered fear. There was a shot that cracked the night with a sound like a struck bell. It was close. Alicia moved before thought. She moved with a force, an inevitability I had seen in other arenas of her life. Boardroom answers, courtroom refusals. She stepped forward, and then the space between them contracted into a human moment that would remain with me like a scar. When Luca fell, it was not cinematic. There was no cinematic slow motion that made sense of it. There was a small, terrible finality. His body went limp in a way that made the rest of the world seem illogically bright. The man who had been the architecture of the house's safety was just a person who had decided he could no longer carry his secrets. Alicia had done the thing we would later call necessary. She had done it with a hand that was steady and eyes that had become hollowed with cost. I learned in the seconds that followed that killing someone, even to protect, is not a clean ledger entry. It is a fracture. It leaves debris in the heart. I had trained to take things apart on theory and practice, but watching a life end, even a life of someone who had chosen betrayal, left the breath jagged. Alicia's hands trembled the slightest as she released the weapon. She looked not triumphant but emptied, like water poured out of a cup to put out a fire and finding the cup useless afterward. We left in a night shaped by smoke and sirens. I will not say how, because the way we left is not heroic to describe, and the details are not the point. We drove with roads that seemed to move of their own will, and when we stopped, we found a safe house that smelled of old books and boiled coffee. It was shabby and small, and had the stubborn honesty of places that exist because someone cares enough to keep them. Everything in that house seemed to whisper about exile. That night, Alicia did not sleep. She sat with her hands in her lap, the rawness in her face a scandal I had no way to remedy. I watched the way she held herself, an empire gone thin at the edges. She spoke in fragments, the way people do when they try to rebuild the world one small sentence at a time. "They came for me," she said finally. "We always knew someone would come for me." "Who?" I asked, even though I already knew in the way you know the weather. "Who would want to start a war like that?" She looked at me with eyes that for the first time invited me into the arithmetic of her life, not as an observer, but as someone she might have to explain herself to. "People who think I am a symbol and not a person," she said. "People who profit from my removal. People who assume absence will make their lives simpler." The room measured our history in small things. Smoke, a borrowed cup, the key necklace resting against my collarbone, and the silence was dense with things unsaid. We had saved ourselves, and in doing so we had not saved the things that mattered. Luca's death created a hole that would not be filled by explanation. She told me then, with a flatness that was not cruelty but exhaustion, that the senders, the shadow I had once worked for, were a different kind of animal. "They will not be satisfied with a file or two," she said. "They will come back, and they will expand their reach. They will find a new way to weaponize my life." The thought of returning to the tower, of walking into the rooms we had left behind like a bandaged person going back to a battlefield, felt like a suicide dressed as a choice. But Alicia had already anticipated a different kind of solution. She had made contingencies for living out of sight, because that was the one language she had learned well, to disappear if the cost of staying was greater than endurance. She proposed something that in its coldness had the ring of mercy. "I can make them believe I'm dead," she said. I must have laughed, because the humor was the only defense left to me. "You disappear?" I said. "You, with your empire?" She smiled, but it was a wan smile, like someone rearranging a small coffin. "I did not build what I have to keep everything forever. I built it to survive. I can survive elsewhere. I will stop being their symbol. I will stop being their target." There was a logic to it that should have been infuriatingly simple. If she died, the reasons they chased her would lose their object. If she disappeared, their attention might sift away. She had done the math and decided to sacrifice presence for safety. She would turn her life into an absence so that those she loved, those she might come to love, could live without being stalked. "You will kill yourself?" The words felt naive, as if I had not seen the pieces she used to construct her world. "You will just vanish?" "No," she said. "Not vanish. Recreate. And before that, make sure you have a life that isn't under my thumb." The plan she sketched was brutal in its tenderness. She wanted to fake her death convincingly. Documents. A scene that wrote the story of her end. Something that would be accepted by the world as a closure. But she also wanted me to be somewhere safe, while the world accepted the fiction. She placed the burden of living into my hands, as if handing me a lit match, and asking me to guard it from wind. "You will go," she said. "You will live. They will find me dead and move on. I will make sure that in their minds, I am over." The word "we" dissolved into two separate contracts, her disappearance and my exile. I was furious, not because I loved her less, but because the magnitude of her decision reduced me to a survival problem. It was as if she had decided the price herself and asked me to pay my half in absence. "I won't let you do this alone," I said then, because honesty had more ballast than calculation. "If you die to save me, I will spend the rest of my life proving it wasn't necessary." She shook her head. "You are not a cause," she said. "You are a person. You deserve a life where your name is not arcane. You deserve the chance to be ordinary." There was a tenderness in that which nearly undid me. She wanted me to be ordinary because she could not see ordinariness as a place for herself. It was a beauty and a transgression. When the plan unfolded, it was as theatrical as any conclusion she had ever staged. She arranged a scene, subtle misdirection, an event at a remote part of the docks, a staged confrontation designed to be ambiguous enough for the press to decide. She prepared artifacts to support the narrative of her end, a charred car, documents scattered like a narrative of finality. She drafted letters to be found in the wreckage, the kind of graceful goodbye that would settle the rumor houses. She composed everything the way a woman writes a resignation letter, precise, with corners folded to exactness. And yet, before she left, because she insisted on one precondition, she took my hands and looked at me with the cruelest, kindest clarity. "If I do this," she said, "there is one thing I need you to do for me." I waited, thinking it would be a practical thing. Contact a lawyer, move to a cabin, leave viral trails. Instead, she handed me a small envelope. Inside was nothing but a slip of paper and a necklace I had not noticed before. A small charm in the shape of a tiny key, the very one I had found in my drawer. There was a note, hurriedly written in her precise script. "Leave. Live. Burn what I taught you. Keep the key if you must. If you love me, don't become a ghost in my name." Her lips brushed my forehead, the smallest of benedictions. "You will be angry," she said. "You will hate me. Live with that. Prosper. If you love me, live." She left before dawn in a way that had the theatricality of a soliloquy, the staged drama that would later convince the world of her end. I watched until she blurred into stranger sizes on the horizon, until even her silhouette had been absorbed by the pale morning. She had with her the pieces of an empire and the plan to make the world believe she had been erased. I had with me a necklace and a note, and the most private of debts. The knowledge that she had chosen absence to secure me a future. The days that followed were a slow abrasion. The press did what it does. It built monuments of rumor and erected shrines for grief. The city mourned in the way societies do for icons, with flowers and hashtags, and a vacuum in the business channels. There was a funeral, not for the dead, but for the living narrative we all preferred to accept. I watched the funeral on television and ate the world in black and white. There was a moment in the press cycle when they showed a photograph of the scene she had left behind. The charred car, the scattered papers, the absence that needed no further embellishment. Among the reporters, a certain ritual unfolded. Someone would say a verdict, and the public would accept it. I felt the acceptance like a physical weight, as if a great hand had spread a blanket over everything. For days, I could not move from the small rented room I had taken in the outskirts. The necklace felt like a hot coal at my throat. The day she left, she had placed a second envelope in my hand. This one smaller, heavier. Inside was a single sentence. Trust yourself. Do not let them tame your anger into patience. I did not trust myself for a long time after that. I ate and slept in the broken fragments of a life I had not chosen. I made a mess of normal tasks. I took a job washing dishes in a small cafe on a coastline that smelled of salt and old boat paint. It was the kind of place people who had given up on escalation retired to, and in that retirement there was a certain mercy. The cafe was narrow and honest, with a counter scarred by elbows and a coffee machine that ran like a content beast. I learned the language of steam and the comfort of grinding beans. The customers were local, their conversations small as the cups they drank from. I learned to measure out the hours with the precision Alicia used for things that mattered. In the space where my life was not an assignment, I found fragments of myself that had not been disciplined into usefulness. I kept the key on a thread, tucked beneath my shirt. Sometimes I would touch it and feel an ache that was both gratitude and accusation. I had been given a reprieve and a punishable guilt all at once. I catalogued everything in memory instead of in a ledger. The way the tide hit the rocks, the taste of coffee at dawn, the sound of putting sugar into a cup. It was small work, and it kept me sane. Months became calendar entries. Public funerals for a woman who had been a threat to many and a love to one. The world learned to accept her absence. The senders, the shadow I had been answering to, said nothing at first. At last they offered me one inked message, well done. But the congratulations were as empty as any decree. Completion is a poor salve for losing what you never expected to own. On a gray morning, months into a new, quieter life, I was closing the cafe when the television in the corner hummed to life with an anchor woman's voice. The news item was small, the kind that sits between weather and a local fundraiser. It was about a protest in a port city 3 hours north, a demonstration that had turned chaotic. The footage was raw and handheld, screaming, placards, a woman leaving the frame with a package in her hands. And for a single frame, 2 frames, 3, a wrist was visible, a small anchor tattoo just under the sleeve of a cheap coat. The camera cut abruptly to an image of a burning banner. I rewound the footage in the replay, heart knocking like a fist against a door. It was an anchor tattoo, the same one I had once seen someone wear in a photograph that had come through the surveillance room months ago. Small, unadorned, placed with the thoughtfulness of someone who keeps a token for a storm. I felt it as a call. It was ridiculous, perhaps, to let a small mark of ink on a stranger's wrist reroute my life. But I had been trained to notice patterns, and an anchor was not a ubiquitous choice. Alicia had never been given to overt sentimentality, but she had tattoos somewhere she would not show in public. She had once rolled her sleeve in conversation, and I had caught a flash of dark ink, like an exclamation point. In that moment, I had filleted the image away as one of those small truths, a useless detail until it wasn't. I closed the cafe early and booked a ticket north. The senders did not respond to a frantic message I sent that was more confession than report. Possible sighting. Anchor tattoo. No further intel. All I had was the frame of a wrist and a memory of how her hand found mine in a house full of monitors. The hunt was not the same as the mission I had begun with. The beginning had been cold. A job, a target, an objective. Now it felt like a search for a missing argument in a life, like searching for a punctuation that would allow a sentence to be read differently. I traveled without many plans, because the only thing that had any urgency was the ache that had been made into a compass. I found nothing for weeks. Rumors, false leads, a woman who matched Aline's silhouette in a market stall, and then vanished. I grew used to failure a different way than I had been used to it in my previous life. Failure became less a badge of incompetence and more a measure of endurance. I learned how to sit with not knowing and come back intact. Then I saw her. It was not how I had imagined. There was no spectacular reveal, no dramatic kick drum of fate. I was closing up one afternoon, the late light making the cafe countertops look like polished chestnut, when the bell over the door chimed. I looked up because of habit, and for one breath the room rearranged itself into two shapes: the girl I had been used to seeing in frames and portraits, and the woman who had haunted my sleep. She stood in the doorway looking like she had stepped in from a painting that had been washed to soften the edges. Her hair was cropped shorter than before. The sharpness that used to outline her features had been rounded by something gentler. She wore a sweater that looked like it had been chosen for warmth, not effect, and around her neck, beyond any expectation, was an ordinary cord with a small tin charm, an anchor. Her eyes found mine. For a moment, the world contracted to the span between us. I recognized the way she measured me, a precise assessment less cold now, more haunted by something like apology. She crossed the room as if she had practiced this path in 100 nightmares and still found it terrifying. "Hello," she said, and even the word had the weight of trenches behind it. "Hi," I replied, though my voice wanted to betray me with the speed of the years. "You?" She shook her head as if to clear static. "Sit," she said. "You look tired." I found a chair on some instinct that felt less voluntary than urgent, and watched her as she closed the distance between the counter and my table, with small, deliberate steps. She carried no entourage. There was no drama, which was perhaps the most dramatic thing of all. We spoke like people who had once owned a whole world and then been exiled from it. We navigated around the landmines, the betrayal, the killing, the months of smoke and absence. Alicia spoke carefully as if every sentence might be a small concession. "I thought it would be enough to disappear," she said. "I thought I could be a ghost and that would be a mercy." "You thought by faking death you could keep me alive," I said. "You thought you could keep me from being dragged into whatever agenda started this war." "I did what I thought would give you a chance to be ordinary," she said. "I had no right to make that decision for you." I had 1,000 things cued like retorts, but the easiest truth had the loudest voice. "You did it," I said. "You left." It was not an accusation, not exactly. It was a notice of what had been done. She made a small, humorless sound. "Yes." There was a long pause during which the cafe's clatter shrank to a background noise, and the sea wind at the window sounded like a distant memory. Outside, a couple argued in a language I didn't know. Inside, 2 people had been remade by choices that had cost them everything. "You could have come sooner," I said finally, the sentence not saying everything I wanted it to, but saying enough. "You could have told me, or let me decide." She took a breath and did something I have not seen her do often. She flinched and admitted fault. "I was afraid," she said. "Not of dying, but of what I would become if I stayed. I thought I could protect you by sacrificing myself." "That was your decision, not mine," I said. I wanted to be angry in the way that burned and cleansed. Instead, I felt a heavy grief that was both mine and not mine. She looked at her hands as if counting each line. "I thought I could walk away from what I built and not have it keep clawing at me," she said. "But absence left a smaller, meaner version of me behind. I lost my place in people's lives, and worse, I nearly lost my place in yours. I didn't know how to come back without ending something that had to die. I had seen power dressed in many fabrics, but I had never seen it so vulnerably staged. Alicia was not asking for absolution. She sought an audience, something like a witness to the truth that she had burned for me. "I watched you in the beginning," I said. "I watched you kill the man who had been your safety. I watched you choose absence. All of it is part of why I left the tower and why I stayed away. She placed a palm over the knot at my throat where the key rested. Why did you? She started. Because no one gives you directions about how to love someone they hired you to destroy, I replied. There is no manual for that. I had to figure out if the woman I loved, if I can say that, was someone who could come back. The cost, she said. The word was an economy, laden, unavoidable. It was yours, I said. You decided it. You chose the ledger. But you also made me live and make my own choices. We sat in a silence that tasted like the pause between two long breaths. The conversation at last found a rhythm not of accusation, but of peeling back layers. She told me what she had done in exile, how she had lied about her death to placate enemies, how she had crawled through small economies and dirty hands to stitch a different identity together. She had taken laboring jobs. She had slept in places that did not belong to the wealthy. She had learned what it means to be nobody. It had been a purification of sorts, she said, and also a kind of penance. I could have come back and reclaimed things, she said, but I knew reclaiming would be a performance. I had to ask myself whether I wanted the kingdom more than the person I could be with you. Her voice broke then, not with theatrical melodrama, but with a small human sound that had no office to hide behind. I wanted to believe her. Part of me had never stopped believing because belief is a stubborn currency. Part of me was still angry because she had chosen to make me suffer without my consent. But there was also a clear-eyed hunger in her. Not for power, she said, but for a life free of the chain she had forged. I am tired of running, she said. If there is a life with you, it will be one where I try not to hurt you. I have no illusions I can undo everything. I have done harm. I am seeking to repay, not with money, but with presence. I can't promise I won't break things. I can promise I will try. The confession was smaller than I had expected, and larger than anything else she had offered me. It carried the real weight of someone who had chosen to step outside of a script they had written all their life. We spoke then of what it would mean for her to stay. It would mean exposure. It would mean enemies that would smell her name and not let it drop. It would mean I would no longer live an ordinary life. It would mean living in the shadow of acts we both had made. It would be costly in ways money could not fix. You could leave again, I said. Because the worst thing would be to lock her into a fate of selfless martyrdom. I could, she said, but I won't. Not this time. I have run from my life long enough. I have tried to be small by vanishing and big by being a myth. Both have ruined me. Here is the choice. I can try to dismantle what I started, or I can continue to hide. If I dismantle it, I risk everything. If I hide, I risk being hollow. I choose... She stopped, searching. I choose the risk of being whole. That night we left the cafe together. We did not plan an escape route or a safe word. We walked into the rain like two people who had been given a second chance and did not know the terrain it would demand us to cross. We walked slowly, because for the first time in a long time, there was no collapsing objective to prompt us forward. There was simply a desire to be near one another and to see what questions would arise from proximity. Everything about our reunion was a negotiation. Trust is not rebuilt in grand gestures. It is amassed in small acts. I learned to trust her when she left her phone in the kitchen and did not need to check it. She learned to trust me when I admitted everything I had hidden about the mission and the senders. We spoke of Luca in a grief that had no neatness. We spoke of the men she had hurt, and the ways in which harm cannot be undone with promises. The days that followed were not triumphant. They were practical. We had to decide how to handle her past without letting the past destroy the future. She would not simply hand her empire to anyone. Some debts are moral and cannot be sold. But she began, in small, abrasive ways, to unravel the public mythicalness she had once curated. She spoke with lawyers and accountants, and people who had once been her enemies, and asked for their help in winding things down responsibly. She offered restitution where it was possible and asked for anonymity where there were no practical obligations. People who had power rarely surrender it without a cost. The cost here was simple and predictable. Enemies who saw opportunity where she saw atonement. I learned quickly that goodwill does not cancel old sins. There's a cruel arithmetic in the world where gestures of good faith become new ways for old enemies to take advantage. So we worked in the daytime and planned for threats at night. We cultivated a small life. That was the word Alicia used. Cultivate. She wanted to learn how to keep a garden instead of an empire. We painted one wall in the cafe a brave blue. We argued about nothing and apologized for everything. On evenings when the world felt heavy, we would go down to the rocks and talk in small confessions. She would talk about childhood nights when her parents had been too proud to ask for help. I would tell her about the kitchens I had left behind. We would try to plan. We would fail. We would admit how much pain lingered like an old bruise. The public record, it turns out, has a short memory. The story of the billionaire who vanished made way for new stories. A corporate war, a scandal, an election. But the private consequences held on like a rash. Opponents of Alicia's empire began to sense weakness and a few took interest. There were men who thought the cracks signaled opportunity. We were not naive. We spoke often of contingency plans and safe words, and the inevitability that danger might still come. When an old enemy did arrive, a few men who believed in the value of violence, their attempt had a different shape now. No dramatic explosions, nothing cinematic. It was a quiet extortion, legal and illegal braided together, a letter threatening to publish names unless certain accounts were opened. Alicia handled it the way she always had, with economy and a refusal to be intimidated. She opened accounts to a lawyer, established funds for the victims of those hurt by her past, and then she stepped into the fray with more willingness to be accountable than I had ever seen. The most dangerous things we faced were the soft ones. Mistrust when an unplanned silence lasted too long. The old reflex in my body to check doors and windows in the night. The small betrayals in memory. But danger also taught us the practicalities of staying together, like learning to make an ally of fear instead of its prisoner. One night, sitting at the counter in the cafe, watching steam coil from cups like small ghosts, Alicia took my hands and said, "I can't promise a life without shadows." "I don't want to promise," I said. "I want someone present." She looked at me the way someone sees not just features but history. "Then let us be present," she said. "If I have to dismantle what I made, I will do it with you around me. If I have to answer for what was done, I will answer. I will not hide you as a preserve. I will not use you as a refuge. I will be with you, too fallible, too human, and too stubborn to vanish again." We did not get an easy redemption. There were nights when I woke with the phantom weight of something heavy on my chest, the memory of a man who had died because of loyalty misapplied. There were times when I saw an old associate of the empire in a market and felt my stomach drop. There were times when her hands tightened on mine and I thought of all the things she had done out of fear. But there were also mornings when she brought an extra croissant, or left a note folded into my coat pocket with a flippant doodle. There were afternoons when we sat and did nothing in particular, and it felt like a miracle, because two people who had been trained to strategize were finally experimenting with the small boredom of ordinary companionship. We learned to keep a shared calendar not of meetings, but of meals. 1 year later, we stood in front of a small registry office that smelled pleasantly of lemon. It was absurd to think of legal validation as a reward for survival, but we wanted the little things that made the body of a life. We signed papers with wobbly hands, and a clerk said, "Congratulations," in a voice that folded us into easy legality. We walked into the sunlight like two people who had survived storms and kept the pieces that mattered. There were no fairy tale endings. We made mistakes. We angered one another in ways that were not noble. We also laughed at the stupid things life asks you to do. We cultivated a garden that never flourished like those in glossy magazines, but that fed us with the stubborn satisfaction of survival. We opened a small back room in the cafe for a book club that read badly and argued well. People asked, sometimes kindly, sometimes with the bluntness of curiosity, how I could fall for someone placed in my life by a shadow. The answer is complicated and ugly and glorious. I was trained to be a weapon. I fell in love with the person who was the reason that weapon tried to change course. I fell for a woman who was dangerous and tender, and who understood, finally, that power need not be the end of her story. If you had asked me on the first day in the tower whether it would end like this, I would have laughed in disbelief. Everything had seemed tactical then. Proximity, surveillance, proof. Falling in love was not on any list. It was not in any briefing. It was the kind of disruption that cannot be theorized. There were consequences. There always are. But what we built, careful, imperfect, stubborn, was a life negotiated between two people who could both admit where they had been wrong. She learned to let go of the fetish for control that had once defined her, and I learned, painfully and gratefully, how to trust someone who had once been my enemy. We did not erase the past. We paid for it in ways that never make the ledger balance. But we found a new currency: presence, accountability, tenderness. On the days when the world felt safe enough, we would walk down to the rocks and talk about smaller futures. We would imagine a house not of commands but of curtains. We would cook instead of staging the world. Sometimes she would make a mess, and I would laugh at the sight of her frustration when eggs refused to be perfect. It was the best kind of mundane, a quiet rebellion against the life we had both once been forced to live. Once, sitting beneath low clouds, she reached for my hand and said, "You were sent to destroy me. Falling in love with you was never part of the plan." I leaned into her and felt how true that was, the whole tragic, ridiculous, beautiful truth. "I was trained to do one thing," I said. "I was not trained to choose. Loving you nearly made me lose everything. It also gave me something to keep, which is rarer than it sounds." She smiled, and in the crease of her mouth there was the memory of everything and the stubborn hope of a future that could be more than a ledger. "Then let us be careful together," she said. "Not careful in the way of building walls, but careful like someone tending a flame." We kept tending the flame. We made mistakes. We apologized. We paid debts. We tried to make sure our love never again became an instrument to shield someone else from consequence. It was not a neat arc from villain to saint. It was a daily, often clumsy work of being humane. If you listened closely, there was an edge to our stories, of violence visited, of choices made in rooms lit by two keen bulbs. But primarily, there was a small, steady insistence on the possibility of reformation. Not redemption, because some things cannot be redeemed. Rather, the work of making a life where the same errors are not repeated, where power is not wielded as a blunt instrument. We kept the necklace, the little key, wrapped in tissue in the cafe's back drawer. Sometimes when I was serving coffee, I would touch it and think of the moment I had been given a choice between the proffered mission and a precarious tenderness. I had been sent to destroy a queen, and instead I had been given a crown of a different sort, one that demanded honesty above all. If someone still asks where the moral sits, I would say this: we were both agents in a world that teaches that survival often comes at the expense of others. We chose, awkwardly, imperfectly, to find another way. That choice cost us knights and allies and the naive illusions we had used to justify distance. It also gave us ordinary mornings and small jokes, and a life that could be counted in the trivial things that make up the body of a day. It would be dishonest to pretend everything is healed. The past turns up like cold weather in spring. Once in a while, a document will surface, or an old associate will try to profit on a memory. We respond. We defend where defense is necessary, and we apologize where apology is owed. We live with the knowledge that the scale of our earlier decisions will continue to have shadows. But there is a particular kind of gratitude that lives between us. One that began the day I walked out of an office into a life I had not planned, and into a love that was not on any agenda. Falling for the billionaire ice queen was not part of any map I had been handed, but it became the geography I built my life around. If you are still wondering whether love can survive the kinds of choices we've made, I will not pretend it was easy. It was messy and it was frightening, and it required more courage than I had thought possible. But it also gave me the rare chance to tell a woman who had once been a fortress that she could be fragile and still be loved. So we stayed. We worked. We broke things and rebuilt them. We argued and made peace. We made a life. If this story spoke to you, if you love dangerous romances and slow-burning reunions, stay with us. Subscribe for more stories where hearts are not spared their trials, but are given the chance to heal.